There's still plenty of space up front. Unlike some of our events, the front row is not reserved today, so please feel free to come on down. All right, I will get started, and hopefully our panel will fill up. My name is Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbank Center. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the kickoff event for our series this fall, PRC at 75. As many of you know, 75 years ago, on September 21st, 1949, Chairman Mao Zedong famously declared at the first plenary session of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the Chinese people have stood up. This was followed by 10 days later, the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which was done in an open ceremony at Tiananmen Gate, at the heart of the imperial heart of what had been the Forbidden City in China. A proclamation that the people of China were now claiming its own governance. That marks the 75th anniversary tomorrow, for which we have heard very confident remarks on the part of the current chairman, or I should say General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, who declared very much today in an address, no challenges can stop China's progress. Of course, we have seen the ups and downs, the many changes that have transpired over the course of the last 75 years. But I think it goes without saying that the last 75 years of the People's Republic deserve very much an introspection on the part of all of us to think about not only where China has been, but also where China is headed. And so it's a delight to welcome all of you to be a part of this series with all of us this fall. There is a brochure that goes through all of the events that we will be having this fall. This includes a series of lectures, a film series, a series of talks, and so forth on where the People's Republic of China is headed. But for today's event, we invited some of our own faculty to reflect back on where China has been and to discuss where China is going. I will introduce the two faculty members we have here with us today. A third faculty member, unfortunately, is ill and cannot be here with us. That's Elizabeth Perry. And I'm hoping that is not the case with Professor Fewsmith. But on my left, we have two experts to discuss the state of the People's Republic of China at its 75th anniversary. First, to my immediate left is Professor Tony Saich. Tony is the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he is also the director for the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia, located within the Ash Center. And then to his left is Professor Yuhua Wang. Professor Wang is a professor in the government department within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming both Professor Saich and Professor Wang to this discussion here today. I'm going to sit down, and I'm just going to take the prerogative to perhaps kick off this discussion a little bit differently than we might have expected. But Tony, let me pose the question first to you. You are a renowned expert on so many different dimensions of Chinese politics, but I want to focus specifically on your last book, which made quite a splash. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it was entitled From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party. So I wanted to ask if you could just quickly sort of first take us on that journey from 1921 to 1949 and to discuss, just very quickly, right, 28 years, a civil war, a world war, a long march, and so forth. But just very quickly, right, sort of, what was the state of the People's Republic, and what did the party itself envision at this moment when Mao and his comrades were triumphant in Beijing or Beiping at the time, right? And were proclaiming the establishment of the People's Republic. And what did they envision when they claimed power on behalf of the people itself?
Thanks, Mark. First of all, I feel much better about life having read Xi Jinping's comments today. I try and encapsulate that in, I would say 6 features of the party which have remained fairly constant over time. But I want to start off with a general comment about Xi Jinping's style of rule. And it's been usually written about that it really resembles that of Mao Zedong. However, what I want to point out is that in terms of the party, the better point of reference is the ultimate party man, Liu Shaoqi, rather than Mao Zedong. Mao himself was willing to dispense with the party when he saw it as inconvenient or getting in his way. He also speculated on a future where there would be no party, and he said it would be wonderful, in fact. Liu Shaoqi, by contrast, was a clear Leninist disciplinarian, albeit with a Chinese glossary over it, as shown in his work, How to Be a Good Communist, which is really a Confucian-influenced tract for the modern Leninist age. However, of course, confusing things even further, it was Liu Shaoqi who was the main proponent that pushed forward the Mao cult in the 1940s and into the 1950s. One thing that is certain is that Xi Jinping has the tools, the power, the influence at his disposal that previous generations of leaders could not imagine. And on the global front, of course, those comprise carrots and sticks, carrots of investment, sticks of punishment, and so on and so forth. Crucially, though, I think even from the late 20s all the way through, including the post-1949, the party has consolidated the features of a Leninist party under the core organizing principle of democratic centralism. I want to just quickly itemize 6 things which I think are consistent since 1949. First is that it remains the organization and propaganda party to ensure that all party members remain on message and society is aware of what is expected behavior. I think under Xi Jinping, the one noticeable shift has been the revived stress on ideology. I think for a period of time, certainly not in the 50s, certainly not in the 60s, but under the reform period, I think people began to downplay the role of ideology in China's development, shifting to the idea it's become much more pragmatic. But I think we've seen not only organization, but the revival of ideology being extremely important under Xi Jinping. Secondly, it remains, in the view of the leadership, the infallible party. It's incapable of making a mistake. So any serious mistakes have to stem from the machination of individuals, for example, the Gang of Four in the 1960s, or the interference of hostile foreign forces, most notably the United States of America. What that means is that really consistently through its history, the party has been incapable of accepting agency and its own role in failed policy outcomes. I think that lack of accountability of the party elite is reinforced by the high degree of autonomy that the Chinese Communist Party has enjoyed from social forces. And this was also the case from 1949. Even though it claimed to be the party for peasants and workers, it has certainly lost the workers after 1927, and it's debatable to the extent to which it represented the interests of the peasantry. So its self-ascribed role as a vanguard party has meant that it has taken upon itself the right to speak on behalf of the people. Thirdly, then, this means that it is the controlling party. Xi Jinping strongly believes in the indispensability of the party, unlike Mao, and the party is the only entity that can move China forward, and also it acts as the moral arbiter for society. Fourthly, though, and importantly, it is the collectivist party. Its fundamental principle is that the interests of the collective, of course, as defined by the party leadership, are paramount to those of the individual. The view is that the individual will gain more from giving up certain freedoms to the collective than they would by acting alone. This, of course, has become increasingly a challenge in the reform period as markets have become stronger and you see much more expression of individual desires and wishes. Fifthly, yet despite all of this, it has shown itself to be, when necessary, an adaptable and flexible party. I don't think it could have survived the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution or other things unless that was the case. And that's helped by the indigenous nature of the revolution. So in the 1950s, it was able to drop the Soviet model when it didn't suit it. It was able to pursue its own experiments, and of course its own experiment under reform and opening up. Earlier in history, it has shifted from being an urban-based revolution to one nested in rural strongholds where local politics caused the party to adapt to local conditions. I've always loved a particular quote by one of the leaders, Peng Zhen, who ruled over the Jinchaji base area. And he stated, and I quote from him, "The building of state-owned enterprises in the countryside was like building a skyscraper on shifting sands or painting a cake to prevent hunger." So those are the kind of practices that I've seen it develop before and through 1949. And I think one of the questions looking forward is whether those practices serve the Chinese Communist Party well, and are they suitable for the future? The last feature that I just want to mention is that one inheritance has been the inability to deal effectively with leadership succession. In its entire history since 1921, there's only been one successful leadership transition. And I think here we confront an issue with Xi Jinping's decision to extend his rule that pushes succession into a very uncertain and unpredictable future.
Great, thank you very much, Tony. That's an excellent overview, not just of where the party was headed in 1949, but also the continuities here at the party over the last 7.5 years. Let me also welcome to our panel Professor Joe Fewsmith. Welcome, Joe. Professor Fewsmith is a professor of international relations and political science at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He's also a center associate at the Fairbank Center. I won't do the unfair thing that has happened to me sometimes at the panel where I show up and have a question immediately directed at me. So it'll give you a couple minutes to catch your breath and get a drink. And so I'll direct the next question then over to Professor Wang. So Yuhua, you're the author of a book that came out recently that also garnered a lot of attention, The Rise and Fall of Imperial China. But certainly you stop, right, with Imperial China. But help us to sort of situate the People's Republic or the last 75 years within the larger continuity and context of Chinese history.
Thank you so much, Mark. And also thank you all for coming. I'm always a fan of history, but speaking of history in this room with so many distinguished historians is like playing with fire. But let me just try to see, as a political scientist, my understanding of history and how that can educate us about contemporary China. While I was reading history, one concept brought actually by historians really fascinated me. This is the idea of dynastic cycles. John King Fairbank talked about this in his own work as well. And then the idea of dynastic cycles is basically the quality of leaders will deteriorate over time within the dynasty, and then you have rise and fall of dynasties. At the beginning, you have usually a very strong rebel leader who founded the dynasty. You know, you can think about Qin Shi Huangdi, Liu Bang, all those founders of dynasties in China. But then the problem with imperial rule is you have to find a son who succeeds you, and then you cannot always find a very smart son. Sometimes you have a dumb son, and then you have to, who is the oldest son, and then that's the rule. Therefore, the quality of the emperors would deteriorate over time. So policies, they will make mistakes over time, but also at the same time, at the local level, you have local strongmen, local landlords. They would take more land from the peasants. So you have inequalities, right? That rose up, and then people would be very unhappy. They rebel, and then you have a new dynasty, right? So that's how Chinese history was repeating itself for about 2,000 years. And then I always find that idea of dynastic cycle very interesting. And then recently, I've been, this is 75th anniversary of the PRC. Certainly PRC is now the dynasty, but I always think about whether the PRC, this new regime we are living under, can escape the dynastic cycle. That is, can we really escape this idea that you have deteriorations of rule, and then you have rebellions, then you have a new dynasty. I do think that the PRC so far, right, has done really well. if we think about all the Chinese dynasties in the last 2,000 years, I did a back of the envelope calculation among all the dynasties. The average length, duration is 70 years, so 70. And so which means the PRC has outperformed, right, 5 years longer than the average. Also, if you think about other comparative communist regimes, the Soviet Union lasted for 69 years. So from 1922 to 1991, 69 years. And we consider that a very long-lasting communist regime. And while the PRC also has outperformed the Soviet Union. So in terms of comparatively, but also vertically, right, longitudinally, the PRC has done really, really well. And then, but that doesn't mean that there are no problems, right? We certainly know those problems. Let me, talk about some of them. One is leadership, right? I think, one thing that, one reason I want to say the Chinese dynasties didn't escape the dynastic cycles is because rule heavily depended on leadership, not on institutions, right? So in imperial China, if you get to have a strong leader, a smart leader, then you get good policies, you get better rule, people live in peaceful times, and then people were happy. But sometimes I was reading Ming history recently, in late Ming, the country was just so unfortunate to have a series of very dumb rulers, right? And they were playing with carpenter work, and then some of them didn't want to work, and then the country would suffer, right? And then so the whole idea of dynastic cycle is really depends on the leader. And then I don't think PRC has escaped that, which means how China performs pretty much depended on the quality of the leadership. Not only one person, but also the whole collective leadership. And then when we think about, now we are celebrating 75, we can divide basically the 75 years into 3 stages of the PRC, right? The first stage being revolution, right? That's the Mao era. And then the second stage being the reform, and then that's the Deng era. And then recently I would call it the anti-reform era, which is led by Xi Jinping. And then when we think about those very significant policy changes, it's not often about institutional changes. Well, there are institutional changes, but they are caused by leadership changes, right? When we see leadership changes, we see rules are being changed, policies being changed, and then the feelings of Chinese people changed as a change of leadership. And then I think that that's one trap that the PRC hasn't really escaped from imperial China. That is really depends on who the leader is, and then the capability, the vision, the ideas of the leader. And then that brings my next point, that is something that I worry in the next 25 years, that is how succession will work. Because in imperial China, they had a rule, which is primogeniture. So you just select your eldest son. And then that hasn't been an option since the PRC, fortunately, I think, for the country. But I think one pattern that we saw in imperial China, is usually a weak leader usually follows a strong leader. So that's how the dynastic cycle happens. You have a strong leader, and then followed by a weaker leader, followed by a weaker leader. And then that's also what we see in the PRC. After Mao, we have Hua Guofeng, right? But I think China was very fortunate, as Ezra Vogel, as the late Ezra Vogel talked about in his great book about Deng Xiaoping, that I think China is very fortunate to have Deng Xiaoping, that Deng Xiaoping was able to come back and then control the situation. We won't know if Xi Jinping steps down, what would happen. I think it's almost certain that he will choose a weak leader, because that just by definition, you don't want a strong leader as your successor. This is, in political science, this is called the crown prince problem. That is, all emperors don't want a strong crown prince, because if you have a strong crown prince, the crown prince can kill you and get away with it, because they can become the new emperor. Right? So by definition, a strong ruler doesn't choose a strong successor. So, and we don't have Deng Xiaoping anymore. So I think what I worry most in the next 25 years is exactly this succession question that we can talk about more.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for both situating this backwards and highlighting how the People's Republic reflects past dynasties, but also how the institutional structure of the PRC is a bit different than past dynasties, and the succession issue is still very much one that's live with us. Before we sort of turn to the contemporary, Joe, I want to just turn to you and ask you to reflect also on the PRC at 75. And I wanted to draw folks in the audience's attention to a 10-volume series that Professor Fewsmith, along with Nancy Hurst, have put forward called Mao's Road to Power. This is a 10-volume series. It's at the Fairbank Center Library across the street and elsewhere. If you haven't seen it, please do check it out. But it's perhaps the most comprehensive examination of Mao Zedong's journey to power, as well as your recent book, Rethinking Chinese Politics. And the question that I want to ask is something that would sort of tie both Tony and Yuhua's comments. Tony started out by discussing how perhaps even the PRC as it exists today was not per se the one that Mao envisioned, that it was perhaps more Liu Shaoqi and others who are more institutionalists that created the Leninist party that we have today. And we should remember, right, that PRC's predecessor, the Kuomintang, the KMT, was itself a Leninist party as well. And then Yuhua, of course, highlighted, right, the rebel ruler, the importance of that first ruler, and so on and so forth. So the question I just want to pose is, how much of what exists today at the PRC at 75 still reflects the legacy or the ghost of Mao Zedong?
Well, I hope not much. Actually, of course, Mao was very conscious about trying to create a strong, both domestically and internationally, a very strong China. And in that sense, he'd be very happy with today's China. He also had this thing about capitalism. He didn't like it very much. And China is slowly getting rid of that capitalism under his successor. But what has made China strong and wealthy has been capitalism. And so Mao would have to be unhappy with that. Let me just say something about the shadow of Mao, because here's a person who just looms over the political, social, and political spectrum. And, you know, when Deng Xiaoping did get into power, one of the first things that he did was to push for a history resolution, the second one in China's Communist Party history, the second resolution being in 1981, and it was intended to deal with Mao. I'm probably repeating what Tony's already said. Oh, okay. In any case, in that, that resolution really says two things. One, that Mao was a great leader and that his mistakes, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, little mistakes, were the mistakes of a great man. But it was also very harsh on Mao. It made no doubt that the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward were very serious mistakes, gross mistakes, it calls it. And obviously he wanted to cut Mao in half, put those issues aside, condemn them, say that they're all wrong, which would have paved the way for his own reforms. And, and of course he wanted to be able to build on the Maoist legacy, so he really wanted it two ways. Mao was a great leader, but he made gross mistakes. Usually great leaders do not make gross mistakes, maybe little mistakes, but in any case. So I'm sure that Deng Xiaoping wanted that history resolution to settle these arguments and not have people, followers of Mao, argue about this is what Mao really meant. No, he really meant this. I worked with Mao more closely. These things could go on forever. So Deng wanted to put those away. What's interesting I think, is that, well, we've all been thinking about Mao for these, 48 years since he died in 1976. I'm sorry, I didn't do my math. At any case, many of you knew Rick Baum, one of the great sinologists of the period, who wrote a book called Bearing Mao. And I think, just from the title, that you can tell that he thought that Mao really was buried, that the reforms had, put Mao away, that Mao would not rise again, so forth. As we say, Rick was a little premature. Not only, the Chinese people, or at least some of them, worried that Mao would be buried, and they wanted to make sure he would not be buried. One of those people was a person called Zhu Jiamu. I assume the name Zhu Jiamu is not terribly familiar to most of you. He was a secretary to Hu Qiaomu, then a secretary to Chen Yun. He also got credit for being the first person to read the February 7th editorial in Renmin Rabao, run over to Deng Lichun, who was then his boss, and say, if this stands, Deng can't take office. So he considered himself a strong Dengist, but maybe we should say that side of Deng. At any case, he really did worry that the Maoist legacy would be forgotten, and so he wrote an article about precisely about that, and saying he was first. This was in 1979, and so he talked about Liang ge 30年, the two 30-year periods, the period of Mao and the period of Deng, and he was worried that one would be used to criticize the other, specifically that the reforms, which were still riding high at that time, would wipe out the Maoist legacy. And so his argument was that in the first 30 years, Mao had laid the political, economic, social foundations for the following 30 years. And so he had made explorations that were not always successful. And at any case, that was his argument, and that was rejected. That was 1999 article, and there were efforts to put it into the 17th Party Congress. And Jiang Zemin, who was well retired by that time, nevertheless said no. As I get older, I'm more sympathetic to older people having some power. At any case, Jiang Zemin was able to block it. Who accepted it? Xi Jinping. 2013, the idea that Mao had just made mistakes, explorations, the mistakes of a great man, was accepted by the party, and that was, and we have been living with that interpretation of the Maoist period ever since, for the next 10 years. So, in other words, I think the legacy of Mao is still a hot issue, something that the Chinese, particularly the Chinese leadership, is going to continue to fight about. The party, I think, sees the affirmation of the Maoist period as absolutely essential to its legitimacy. If we give up Mao, we basically give up everything. So the question is, so how's it worked out? And, I think most of the last 10 years have been studying Xi Jinping thinking, not Mao Zedong thought. And there's a little bit of a contradiction there. Either the focus is on the big guy over there or on moi. And Xi seems to think it should be on himself. And, the last 10 years, I don't know your interpretation, have not been altogether successful, especially these last, well, if you're judging by economics, every year of Xi Jinping's 10 years has seen a slower growth rate with the one exception of 2021 when the economy was bouncing back from COVID. In some extent, I think nationalism has replaced Mao Zedong thought. But that worked really up until COVID. COVID, I think, has really devastated China in some very fundamental ways that we're yet to find out. I think that could hurt Xi Jinping, the legacy of Mao Zedong, and the succession issue. Right now, there is no sense of who can possibly take over, and Xi has seemed to, maybe he killed all of his sons. Emperors have been known to do that. In any case, I think we have a very rough future in China, and that succession issue I would highlight as probably the most critical.
So, Tony, I want to turn back to you. You've had your two fellow panelists both assert, right, that we're in the middle of a new era. And certainly, right, that is certainly what the General Secretary himself would like for us to believe, right? That we had the revolutionary era, we had the reform era, and now we're in the new era, or the Xi Jinping era. I wanted just to ask if you would agree with your fellow panelists, or to provide a little bit more context as to how you view this, especially as somebody who's so steeped in party history.
I got a couple of comments related to that. I think what is interesting is all three of us have highlighted the challenge of succession in what we've said. And that is where sort of Xi Jinping, in that sense, really does reflect Mao, that he believes that without him in the leadership, the revolution can go astray. And that sets constraints about policy debate, the kinds of issues that China needs to take on to move forward. We're seeing it playing out in society, we're seeing it playing out in the economy. So I do think we're in a new old era. I think new in some of the ways that Joe mentioned, but old still, that the party's not being able to shift away from a certain pattern of doing things. Despite all the disruption that came in the Cultural Revolution, it's fallen back into those kind of Leninist sort of patterns. I had a couple of other thoughts on what my colleague said, is that one of the problems with taking Mao out of the equation is it's not the same as de-Stalinization. Because if you took out Stalin, you still had Lenin. But Mao, in that sense, is the Lenin and the Stalin of the revolution. So as Joe said, what do you have left if you take Mao out of that equation? I really like Chen Yun's judgment on Mao, in which I'm paraphrasing. He said, if Mao had died in 1956, we would have said he was a great proletarian, wonderful leader. If he died in 1966, well, we would still have said he was a great leader, but there were some issues. But he died in 1976, so there's not really very much we can say about it. And I thought, a couple of things, tying back Joe's comments to Yuhua's. The first would be, is what you're talking about with Xi Jinping a relationship back to Mao, or is it a relationship back to what Yuhua has been talking about, a much more traditional pattern and structure of rule within China? So not just Mao and the party, but something perhaps that's deeper. The other question I have to Yuhua is, could you say there was actually a dynastic break after the Cultural Revolution? So then maybe it isn't 75 years, because we've already had a new dynasty, in effect, come and take over.
Yuhua, you want to?
Well, when we think about dynasties, so each dynasty, so why we call it the Tang dynasty, for example, because it's ruled by one royal family continuously, right? So the Tang was ruled by the Li family, the Ming was ruled by the Zhu family. And thinking about PRC, certainly is not ruled by one family, but I do think it's ruled by a group of families. And then that group of families included Mao's family, Deng's family, Xi's family, Bo's family. You have those old elders, right? In that sense, I don't think there's a break in terms of the structure, the composition of those families. We still see those families being very powerful in China. So therefore, it's not like there was this Mao family, but suddenly there's Deng family. I think the Mao family, the Deng family are still extremely powerful in Chinese politics.
So I want to shift our conversation a little bit. As you can imagine, the conversation we've just had for the last 40 minutes or so is perhaps different than a conversation anywhere in China on the PRC's 75th anniversary. But I want to focus on what some Chinese, including perhaps some of our audience members, may be thinking about, right? That over the course of the last 75 years, while there have been mistakes, while there has been a human cost, there has also been progress in terms of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and even going back to what I invoked at the beginning, 75 years ago at the first CPCC, the comment that Chinese people have stood up, right? And so how should we understand the People's Republic in the overall context of what the General Secretary emphasized in his remarks, right? The great national rejuvenation. And how far does the People's Republic itself view as that's a mission that is well on its way to being completed? People have only sort of just gotten up out of the chair, but not really quite stood up yet. There's quite a lot more to be done in terms of this national rejuvenation. And what else more is part of all that? What you alluded to, Joe, earlier, right? If nationalism is the glue that ties all this together, what would that thread look like from that lens here at the 75th anniversary? Open up to any of you who might like to comment.
Well, to me, you're opening up a question about ideology. As the discussions, the debates about Mao Zedong show, ideology remains really important. You've got to put down your program and defend it. But what is that program now? I think that CCP really has a very difficult time articulating what it stands for. Is it common prosperity? We've heard some things about that, but how can you bring about common prosperity without crashing the middle class? That could be a very serious problem. I think along with that, one thing that I guess we haven't mentioned is that Mao Zedong was a man of great charisma. It seems unlikely now, but at the time, he really, maybe it was projected, maybe it was manufactured, but it was there. It seems like Xi Jinping would like to manufacture that charisma, but charisma is not easily manufactured. And, he just, judging by many, many people I've met even over these COVID years, Xi just does not project greatness. He just, and I think that, we're talking about succession. Without projecting some degree of greatness, it's really hard to engineer that transition to a later generation. Just to take the recent example, the recent third plenum in the summer, July, that should have been held 9 months ago. And there was apparently great disagreement in the party about what the third plenum should say. And there was no Deng Xiaoping to say, this is what it's about. I've decided. We think of Xi as a very strong leader. He's really changed the Central Committee every 5 years, and yet he can't tell them when to hold the third plenum. And when they finally did hold it in July, they reversed themselves a week or so ago by stimulating the economy. End of argument. The economy tanked, and that drove the thing. That doesn't strike you as a particularly strong leader. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I have one or two thoughts. I was a student in China towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. And if anybody had said to me that in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, China will be like this, I would have simply said you're insane.
yeah.
So at one level, you can argue that, yes, China has a lot to be proud of through that process, the reduction of poverty, the increased life expectancy, health issues, so on and so forth. And I suppose there's two things related to that. One is other countries performed equally as well without having to go through the kind of traumas to reach that point. So the question is, is it the Communist Party system that brought that about, or are the processes of development which other countries were also engaged in? Lifting people out of poverty is a really interesting area because the largest decrease in poverty actually came before the state intervened and set up the Poverty Alleviation Bureau in the early 1980s. And a lot of that was because of other reforms. Having said all that, if I was a Chinese national, 45 or younger, life seems to go better and better, maybe up until COVID recently, but, expanding freedoms. When I was a student there, birth control was very strict. You had to get approval for who you're going to marry, which was usually political. You couldn't change jobs. You couldn't move cities. You couldn't travel internationally. I mean, all that is now available to Chinese citizens. So I think there's a question of perception of where you are about that. The last thing I just want to comment is looking forward with where China is in the strategies. People talk about the middle income trap. China's indicators in comparison with other countries which are seen as in that middle income, work as Scott Rosell has shown this quite clearly, are worse than the other countries. Nutritional levels, education levels are worse than others. And that raises the whole question about the shift to the high quality growth economy that Xi Jinping wants. One, does it have a sufficiently educated workforce to achieve that? But more importantly, what's going to happen to the 600 or 700 million people that will not be able to participate in that modern, high-quality productive forces economy? That, to me, is going to be a huge, huge problem for China moving forward.
Yuhua, anything you wish to add?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I feel, as Tony hinted, I think, and also Joe mentioned this, I think the pandemic was really a turning point, a very important turning point. Before the pandemic, 2019, I would say, is the peak of everything. People were very confident. This idea of national rejuvenation, right, was very appealing to the Chinese people. Everybody thought, when I was in China, I remember a lot of people thought, China would surpass the US, becoming the #1 economy in the world in a few years. Then the pandemic happened, and now nobody talks about this, right? Nobody's talking about this anymore in China, and then everybody is very pessimistic about the economy. I wouldn't call it national rejuvenation anymore. I would call it national recovery. I think this is, a period of recovery for China. China is trying to get back on its feet, and and also some studies can be done on this. I believe you can look at how people daily use this word, national rejuvenation. I would assume that after the pandemic has dramatically decreased over time.
So let me toss out one last question before I open up to the audience. General Secretary Xi spoke today, and I'm just going to paraphrase from his speech at the 75th anniversary. We must be mindful of potential dangers and be prepared for rainy days. Certainly, I think the danger that you all highlighted is this succession danger, and I think that's not the danger to which he was alluding. But besides the succession issue, if we looked at, when we organized an event at the PRC at 50 and we had looked ahead to the next 25 years, it's not clear we would have forecast, right, exactly how these 25 years would have played out, or even if you had given them this prediction, right, as Tony alluded to, how would you score it, right, and so forth. What are these dangers in your mind if we were to look ahead to the next quarter century? What are the types of rainy days? And will we be looking at or thinking about, and how much of what you see as the storm ahead is one that you think the party itself also sees as the storms brewing on the horizon versus ones that perhaps are storms that will develop out from nowhere?
I think from the party leadership's view, the storms that it sees in the rainy days are not of its own making. I think he's thinking more of the international environment. And 25 years ago, I don't think any of us would have thought that the US-China relationship would be in the situation it is now. Maybe people wouldn't have thought it would still be as positive as people were putting forward then, but that certainly has really changed dramatically geopolitics. It influences trade, it influences investment, it influences things like AI development, tech development, and so forth. And that, I think, is a huge challenge for the Chinese leadership to cope with. You know, how do they have sufficient capacity to push forward with indigenous innovation if they're shut out from a lot of the access to the United States and the West more generally? I would imagine that's a kind of a rainy day that he might be thinking of in that situation. The rainy days I see are somewhat different. I'm not going to talk about succession again, but even though we've seen this huge stimulus that the parties put in just recently, Joe was right. I mean, you know, the third plenum had a different policy that it was going to adopt. And that, I think, most external analysis and many analysts within China don't see that as producing the kind of growth that gets China to, what is it, doubling or quadrupling 2020 GDP by 2020, 2035. It's certainly not going to achieve it. And, you know, we know total factor productivity is declining. We know rates of return in the state-owned sector is declining. And yet the leadership sees that as the key mechanism for driving forward its policy priorities, or at least Xi Jinping sees that. So I think sooner or later, China's going to have to make a shift to much more of a consumption-driven economy. And that is a huge political upshift. You're trying to take money from the government and putting it in the hands of the people, which has never been very good at doing. And that, I think, will have knock-on political consequences about structure of representation and citizen engagement.
Well, I would see. There was an article in Choushi, which is not always my favorite reading material, but when you study China, you take on a painful task, a lifelong task of term. But 2 or 3 years ago, Xi Jinping wrote an article. I don't know whether he's read everything that he's written or not, but he writes an awful lot. But in any case, he was raising quite directly this question of economic development versus security. And he was coming down very hard on the security side. And he said very frankly that this was going to slow China's economic growth, something I'm sure 1.5 billion people love to hear. But he said that this was absolutely necessary. He didn't use the expression rainy days, but that's to defend the national interests of China. And I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but I think that the delay of the recent plenum was that same debate over again. Just one comment that, you know, every day you seem to notice something new in the news, right? Today there was an article about Zhou Tianyong, a well-known economist at the Central Party School, saying that local party secretaries have been, robbing, I guess is the word, the labaixing in their counties and taking their money to pay back government debts, that they are so indebted at the local level that they need to literally steal from the people and give to the government. I hope that that is very rare, but it was it was obviously enough to make this well-known economist stand up and say, we can't do this. And so some of those rainy days are hitting a little bit earlier than I thought, and in ways that I never thought likely, especially when China has done so well economically. In any case, that's a couple comments.
Well, we've
Yuhua?
seen the salary cuts in fairly affluent cities, cut back on some of the social service provisions, which has been reported in the Chinese press. So, yes, there are tensions.
So usually there are three types of threats for a regime like China. The first one being elite coup, right? So elite rebellion against the leader. The second being mass rebellions, just people rise up, like what happened during the Arab Spring. The third is foreign invasion, just foreign country comes in and then take over. I actually did some analysis of imperial China. This is an essay that is included in the edited volume that Michael Sony edited and published by the Fairbank Center. And then I analyzed dynastic fall in imperial China and also how the Chinese emperors died. One consistent finding is it's all about the elites. Yeah. So it's, when elites rebelled, when elites had a coup, then dynastic fell, and then dynastics fall, and then the leaders died. And then all the other threats are secondary. So the masses will rebel only when they see the elites rebelling, and then the foreigners will invade when they see you have an elite struggle in your country. Right? So those concerns are very, very, very secondary. The most dangerous threat to rulers in imperial China was the people around them. So the people they call friends at normal times, and they actually are very, very risky to the rulers. So I think that's what's in Xi's mind, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that's been consistently the case in the Chinese Communist Party since its founding. It's been fallouts, issues within the elite.
So let's open it up to questions. There are two microphones here. I want to first just invite any students, if you would just come on down first if you have a question. Otherwise, we'll open it up to general audience members, so please come on down to one of these two questions. If for access reasons you need someone to bring a microphone to you, please do indicate or wave your hand to one of our staff members, and one of our staff members will be happy to bring a microphone over to you as well. But otherwise, let me just remind everyone, if you could please identify yourself before asking your question, and please keep your question in the form of a question. Thank you.
Hello, yeah. Hi, my name is Saloni Sharma, and I'm a visiting scholar at Harvard Yenching Institute. And my question is, how do you see socialism operate in China after 75 years, and what are some of its manifestations? And it's open to anyone who wants to answer in the panel.
I no longer think of China as a socialist country in any of its dimensions.
I think well, I don't agree 100%, Joe. I mean, I know what you're meaning by that, but I mean, it's decked with the phrase in China, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And as one professor from the Central Party School said, what that really means is whatever the leader wants it to mean at the present time. So it has given it a lot of flexibility to adjust to different circumstances. Why I say it differ a little bit from you, Joe, is that I think ideology is still important in China, and it does set constraints around what the feasible alternatives are for policy. And that's things, where it's still difficult to make certain cases that would fall outside the orbit of some kind of collectivist socialist argument in public and really have them maintained consistently.
Oh, in public, I would agree, but.
Yeah, I'm talking about in public argumentation.
Yeah.
And I think it does set some constraints about policy choices. You know, land has to remain collective, which we all know has led to terrible problems. You know, state-owned preference for state-owned enterprises. So I think there's certain aspects around that. And even I think the idea of common prosperity, I think is a sort of, you know, that goes back into the 50s. Deng Xiaoping talked about it. Xi Jinping has revived it. And I think that is sort of one thing they see as being part of a kind of socialist ideal. And I think we're seeing that with Xi Jinping, the kind of push for criticism of the wealthy. What isn't socialist is that he then doesn't engage in the kind of redistribution of wealth that socialism would imply. I mean, certainly not in that particular case.
Can I chime in on this? So Churchill had a great quote about socialism. He said, capitalism is the unequal distribution of wealth. Socialism is the equal distribution of poverty. And I think when I think about common prosperity, you know, the way Chinese government achieved or is trying to achieve common prosperity is not to make everyone equally rich. They're trying to make everyone equally poor, right? They're cracking down on the capitalists. They're cracking down on the rich people without redistributing to the poor. Xi Jinping actually said this publicly many times that he's against social welfare. He said, you know, just I don't believe in a welfare state where people just get paid without working. You know, he said, you know, lazy people would just, you know, would not work with a social welfare system. So I think this regime is not for social welfare of the poor people. This regime is actually anti-capitalism, which is socialism, but it's not taking care of the poor.
Sort of a Thatcher Reagan-esque version of.
It's actually more. It's very similar to Republicans, right, in this country. That's. Yeah.
Well, the party's always been resistant to welfarism. I mean, when the reform started, it was one of the first things that Deng Xiaoping said. You know, we're not going to be able to expand the welfarism because we'll be expanding in poverty. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, yes, I'm Shang Bo. I'm a G1 student at the Regional Studies East Asia program. So I guess my question is, what happens if and when he steps down one way or the other? I guess none of us know for sure, but if we were to make a bold guess, will we see a chaos left by the power vacuum that he left, or will we see a return to the collective leadership tradition established by Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, or both?
Well, I think the problem with Xi's breaking the two-term rule, which was never a rule, but at any case, is that now that it's been broken, whoever can consolidate power, there is absolutely no reason for that person to step down except mortality. So in that sense, you're back to the imperial system.
Yeah, I think it was signaled at the 19th Party Congress, which should have been the point at which some kind of successor would have been indicated. And I think the fact that that wasn't done made it very clear that Xi Jinping was going to continue to rule. I mean, I think he genuinely believes that he has the solutions. You need a unified type party to get China, you know, through these rainy days, and that without that, there might be ensuing chaos. I mean, there's no real answer to your question. I think the only way you can answer it is to set out different scenarios and what the implications of those might be. And they might range from the chaos, they might be even some kind of orderly succession agreed. I think the one thing, and I remember Joe said this some time ago after the last Party Congress, when everybody was focused, including myself, that everybody in the standing committee of the Politburo is a Xi person. And I remember, Joe, what you said, that won't stop debates, struggles, new factions, new groups forming. And I think that's what we're seeing because of these tensions and strains now around the economy.
Yeah, but do you think that that effort to stop things will create them? That is to say, take all the people in the CYL, for instance. They've been marginalized. And there's going to be a large group of people, some of whom are very talented and well-connected, that are going to complain, You are the exemplar of factionalism.
Yeah.
It's our turn to rule. And I think that given the Chinese political context, I think that could be deadly for the party, either its existence or the prosperity of the nation. So I tend to be one of those who's rather skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, revenge is, we know in the Communist Party, revenge can exist and wait 10, 15 years before you hit back again.
Something about sleeping on firewood and licking the dan. Yeah.
Can I just say very quickly, I think the timeline is very important here. If, as planned, we don't know the plan, but if he steps down in 10 years, or actually maybe more than 10 years, we are talking about the successor, possible successor, who is now in his or her, hopefully, late 40s or early 50s. So this is a very young person, not at the provincial level. Provincial level people now are now in their 60s. So we are talking about like a mayor maybe. And then we don't even know who, because there are thousands of mayors in China. And so it's really hard to know because of the timeline. We are thinking about 10 years from now, and that person is still like a baby now in the Communist Party.
That's interesting, yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming to share with us today. My name is Allison Langenberg. I'm a student at Kennedy School. And my question was about the idea of ideology being part of a huge part of actually military training. And I was wondering, there's been some research that's come out tracking how Mao Zedong thought and Xi Jinping thought have impacted military readiness, because the idea that if you're spending your time looking at this ideological, whether that you could call it wisdom or strategy or indoctrination, might be taking time from military readiness. And I saw this morning on the news that the first Tau-class submarine had apparently sunk during construction, and there have been some other stories that I've seen speculation that spending time working towards this infallible ideology may be impacting military readiness. And on the other hand, if you take one look at, People's Liberation Army, it doesn't seem to be doing too badly. So I was wondering how you would describe the impact of ideological training on military readiness.
I have no idea. But what I will say is that we know in different institutions and apparatuses there have been complaints that we're spending so much time studying ideology, we're not really getting on with our jobs. Whether that sort of has impacted into military preparedness and readiness, you'd have to ask a military expert. I think what really detracted from military capabilities was the dive into business in the 1990s. And there was clear cases where, military units, because of the policies of the 1990s, were basically setting up their own businesses. And there were then a lot of complaints that this was affecting military readiness. The other thing I think which has undermined military capabilities has been the corruption within the military. And we know that now the recently removed Minister of Defense and a number of people in the rocketry and acquisitions divisions were removed because of nefarious dealings. And some reports started coming out there about, substandard military equipment being bought, but the price was set, for whatever the next level up, and that money was being taken out. So I think I don't know whether sort of studying Xi Jinping thought has been a big problem, but I think those two other things, the corruption and engaging in business, has probably had a detrimental effect.
Not to mention loading your rockets with water.
Yeah.
They don't fire as well.
No.
And the nuclear sub just sank, so.
Well, apparently it's now saying it wasn't a nuclear sub is the latest sort of.
Oh, all right, well, a sub.
But a sub, yeah.
That's good enough. That
Yeah.
suggests that somebody didn't do the welding very well.
I will highlight that we will have, as part of our Critical Issues Confronting China series, a talk on this in November, so stay tuned.
Yeah. Bill's trying to get in.
Who's going to get that?
Go ahead.
Is there time for another question?
Yes, please.
Thank you all for your views. A very short question. Political leaders are really inconsistent and they kind of go with the flow. do you find any consistency between Xi's writings or speeches or anything, what he used to think 20, 30 years ago and what is happening now? And would you like to comment on that? Thank you so much.
Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Prabhat. I'm with the Harvard Yenching Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I did not catch the question.
Whether Xi's writings 20, 30 years ago show consistency to now? Whether, do leaders chop and change their views depending on
Oh,
prevalence?
no, I think
Or
he's,
is there a consistency
I
in Xi's
actually
writings?
think that's been I think that's been impressive, that Xi, whether you like his thought or not, has been quite consistent. He likes his own definition of socialism. He's been trying to tighten I would say the central thought of Xi Jinping is tightening party control and, rebuild the party. I tend to think that that's not a particularly good idea if you're trying to lift the economy. And there are lots of other things that, human rights and things like that, that you could deal with. But he's been quite consistent. I'll give him credit for that.
I would say from Xi Jinping's perspective, I agree with Joe's comments, rebuilding the party and strengthening the party was the logical thing to do. Because if you think when he took power, it was a mess. You just had the struggle with Bo Xilai as an alternative. Society seems to be slipping out of control. Corruption was obviously prevalent and really causing concern in society. Local governments seemed to be pursuing their own interests rather than the central interests. So I think from his perspective, and then his reflections on what had happened in the Soviet Union,
Right.
it's a logical trend that he's followed through. We know he made comments about, the military didn't stand up for the party. Nobody was man enough to stand up when the opposition came, and that he was going to make sure that wouldn't happen in China itself.
I agree that he has been very consistent on party building, but if you were a private entrepreneur in China, you would find it, in the past 30 years or even 10 years, I think he hasn't been very consistent on his economic policies, right? That's the trouble that private entrepreneurs are having in China. That is, someday he can crack down on, education industry, on tech, and then now, with the economy suffering, the government is encouraging those industries to develop. And then also when Xi was in Zhejiang and Fujian, remember those were coastal provinces where he was very supportive of private sector development. But after he became the chairman, he's no longer. So I think he hasn't been very consistent on economic policies, I would say.
That's where I think pragmatism has trumped on occasion ideology. I think since he's been in power, I think his ideological direction is clear, but it's kind of blown off course because of currently the collapse or the slowing down within the economy, and then he knows he has to make adjustments, or he's pushed to make adjustments. We really don't know what drives that.
Yeah, so I think this has been a terrific panel, and I've learned a lot. It's a very sober panel. I assume afterwards we'll go out and celebrate the 75 years. But Yuhua's looking at the People's Republican dynastic historical perspective, is very much worth doing. It is something that people think about in China. But one of the distinguishing features in Chinese history of the 20th and now 21st century is the existence of a standing professional military. And every leader of the 20th and 21st century has also been the leader of the military, usually a military person of one form or another. And if you look at the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese Communist Movement controlled China by military conquest. If one or two battles in Manchuria had turned out differently, the capital of the country might still be Nanjing, which is a very nice capital, but the former capital today. But every major political turning point in the history of the People's Republic has been determined with the military as the arbiter. 1949, the intervention, where you could talk about the lack of what happened in 1959, the lack of the military capacity to act independently, 1967, 1976, and the coup d'etat, and 1989, and also 2012, where the military would side, Boshilai, or so. Where is the military in your projections of the future? There's been a constant set of purges, at least of the leadership, during the course of President Xi's leadership, and yet it is still there, and we do believe that his primary source of power at the end of the day lies in being head of the Junwei. So where is the military in China's future, whether it's the China of the People's Republic or something else?
I'll just point out that's Professor William Kirby.
My comrades are pushing me off the deck. I think the military, this is one of the things that I think I've done wrong in my career, is that I have not spent enough time thinking about the military in China. Because as you point out, you can go back to Yuan Shikai and forward or back, and the military is always critical. And in the 80s, I recall China specialists always talking about how the military was back to the barracks and don't worry about the military. And for some reason, I believed them. So I didn't worry about the military. A few years ago, a vice chair of the Central Military Commission by the name of Xu Qiliang said that for a while the military was out of control. He's speaking, of course, of the Hu Jintao era, when Hu Jintao really did not have control of the military. To the extent there was control, it was Jiang Zemin who had appointed the two chairs of the Central Military Commission. And Xu Qiliang was just very blunt that this was an extremely dangerous thing to allow the military to go off on its own. It was basically, he said, basically doing its own thing without anybody in control. And that was dangerous to the party. Of course, what he was talking about was putting Xi Jinping firmly in control of the military. And so that's why I found the corruption of the military to be so interesting. If you look at the 18th, 19th, and 20th party congresses, in each of those 5-year periods, he's gotten rid of the entire military elite, with a couple of exceptions. And yet, he still has to cashier the rocket forces heads for corruption. He didn't know that these people were corrupt before he appointed them. This is bad vetting. I find that really extraordinary. So when we're talking about succession issues, I think that the military should be very near the top of our concerns about that. Somebody who can control the military has to be there, or the party will begin to disintegrate, I think. I like to leave people with optimism.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. My name is Ruslan Yusupov. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Academy. I wonder if I can invite you to discuss a little bit more and approach the question of today's topic from Chinese ethnic borderlands, which seem to define equally the core that we're talking about today. It was only during the Xi Jinping tenure that we started to hear the so-called second generation ethnic policy. And within the broad periods, 3 periods that we talked about today, there's clearly seems to be like a mismatch that the policy, the ultranationalist policies are kind of seem to be really novel at the time of Xi Jinping. So I was wondering, how do you see the ultranationalist policies of the contemporary period different or similar with everything that preceded them? And if you can tell a little bit more about what would be how do you see the impact, those policies, the long-lasting impact that these policies would have on the future of understanding of what it means to be a Chinese? Thank you.
I'm not sure I caught the.
So the question is on the borderlands and the ethnic policies.
Ethnic policies.
And specifically on the discontinuities in the current era compared to the prior eras to which the panel alluded.
I'm not sure there's been a huge discontinuity with the prior period since 1949, perhaps in terms of severity and extent. But I think it goes to two other questions. You know, is the Communist Party's definition of what is Chinese is Han, China? But also the second issue I think related to it is that the Chinese Communist Party has its own narrative of the revolution, the relations, and so on. And what it has always found frightening and dangerous is alternative narratives. And of course, what you have in the borderlands, both the Tibet and also in Xinjiang, you have external points of reference that those people can refer to. And they can tell a different history and a different story that doesn't align and coincide with the master narrative that the Chinese Communist Party is putting forward. So that, I think, has been a constant really through. And it's the way then it plays out in terms of control over policy, yes, has indeed, I think, varied over time. I think it was quite clear when Hu Yaobang was party secretary in the 80s, he did try and make a shift towards policy with Tibet. And then, of course, that was seen as, from our perspective, liberalizing. That was seen as just creating other problems. And then you saw a much a dampening down. And of course, one of the reasons Hu Jintao came to the attention of the central leadership was that when he was in Tibet and that he oversaw the kind of crackdown there. So I think in a broad sense, I don't see a lot of shift, a lot of change, but specific policy, severity of policy may have well varied over time.
I agree.
Well, one change I do think what's happening was the focus shifted from providing more economic opportunities for the ethnic minority, especially in Xinjiang and also in, you think about Xinjiang, Yunnan maybe, to political solutions, right? That is because for many years after the reform, the Chinese Communist Party felt the problem is about the inequality between the Han and then the local ethnic minorities. So the solution has been trying to provide more, right? Building railways and then providing jobs. State-owned enterprises are encouraged to go to the borderlands. But then I think 2007 seemed to be a turning point where they realized even with more economic opportunities, well, first of all, they're mostly taken by the Han people there, but also even with higher income, the ethnic minorities still don't support the regime. So I think after that, there was a shift to more, political education about culture. It's about, language. So there was, I do see there's a change there.
Yeah, I think that also reflects on policy towards Hong Kong and Taiwan. That initially there was the idea that economic development will sort of bring everybody back and that will work. And, you can argue it worked in Hong Kong. Hong Kong millionaires were turned into billionaires and became quite supportive on the whole. And of course it hasn't worked with Taiwan. But I think there was that idea that, join us in a kind of economic union and we can all move forward together. And this somehow will mitigate differences, which hasn't turned out to be the case. And Yuhua's right, similarly, I think, in the ethnic regions.
I think we have time for one last question, if there's a question. Yep, a gentleman in the middle there, if someone could pass that microphone over.
I'm Merv Plotkin, not an undergraduate. I'm wondering how you fit into the idea of the problems, the transitions that might happen, the current activity of the military in the South China Sea with respect to Taiwan? Is it used as a sop to the people to direct their attention away from their problems? And how might that lead, especially as it interacts with the world at large, and it's not just a Chinese issue?
All right. Yeah, Joe, you took it last time. I guess I'll take it this time. I don't think the military does anything without the approval of the senior party leadership. And I don't know, I'm not entirely sure it's kind of deflect people's opinion away from internal troubles. I don't know how many people within China really know what on earth is going on in the South China Seas and so forth. Certainly the military wants to have an important voice in policy that would concern the U.S. cross-straits relations and South China Seas. And it has been very active. We know it built up the 3 islands there. But again, I can't imagine that could have happened without sort of party approval. So I don't think you have a sort of military somehow going off rogue and behaving in a way that isn't at all sanctioned. I mean, I think sovereignty has always been an important issue to the leadership, and very particularly so under Xi Jinping. And of course, for the Chinese Communist Party leadership, these are not international issues. They're domestic affairs. This all belongs to China. So what's the issue, really? And I think what has surprised me, and I think it has surprised some people, if you like, more in the diplomatic sphere in China, is we've created our own problem. You know, we have also been part of creating the conflict with the United States, and that also it hasn't necessarily been in China's best interests to spark these kind of confrontations with the Philippines. In a sense, it's kind of driving people away from the kind of economic interests they were sharing with China into falling back to embracing the US security umbrella. And some people in China, I think, feel that's been actually not beneficial to China's own interests. I mean, of course, before the idea under Deng Xiaoping was, you know, keep your head down, keep out of the way, and that's certainly been abandoned.
Let me just add a couple of things. I guess on the Taiwan issue in particular, I have not been able to find Communist Party references to the Taiwan issue prior to 1942. And their interest in the Taiwan issue was stimulated by an old friend, the commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy, Chiang Kai-shek, who came out with a book, China's Destiny. And he said, we need to get Taiwan back. And then the communists said, we do too. Then, of course, the issue that really made it palpable for the Chinese Communist Party was that Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan. And Mao and others had a whole list of names of people, senior Kuomintang leaders, who they were very serious about capturing and hanging. That was sort of the chief objective at that time. You know, over the number of years, you know, Mao, of course, said, well, we can wait 100 years to solve that issue. It wasn't pressing, and it's gotten more pressing, particularly with the democratization of Taiwan. All of a sudden, you have a very different identity building up in Taiwan. It's no longer a place where the leadership sees themselves as Chinese and sooner or later somehow reconciling themselves in some form of a third united front. No, I think the interest in a united front in Taiwan approximates zero. in any case, now there's the added issue that with military, I don't want to say confrontation, but standoff between the U.S. and China, the U.S. is very good at, and I have absolutely no reliable information on this, so I hope I'm not just spouting off, but to wire the different straits, Bosher Straits and so forth, so that we would know when a Chinese submarine is going in or out. And China, needless to say, would like to be able to have access to the Pacific Ocean without letting the U.S. know that, by the way, we're heading towards Hawaii today. So Taiwan would be very convenient if you built a base someplace, I don't know, around Hualien or some such place. So the reasons for desiring Taiwan back, I shouldn't even say back, the reasons for desiring it shift over the time. But the continuity is the desire, and that has gotten stronger. This is where, I think Xi Jinping perhaps went too far. He's really set himself up so that if he doesn't do anything, he will be criticized, perhaps by others in the leadership, perhaps by Lao Baixing. Anybody that wants to start any sort of demonstration, that would be a great topic.
Just one footnote to what Joe was saying, that if you look at stamps and maps from the Chinese Communist Party in Yan'an in the 1940s, they do not include Taiwan. What they do include is Outer Mongolia.
Is what?
Outer Mongolia.
Oh, yes.
They're on the maps and the stamps. Taiwan is not.
I have a copy of a Taiwan map that shows Mongolia.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
So perhaps this gives you all a sense of just how much there is to discuss in this series about looking backwards at the last 75 years of the People's Republic of China, but also the challenges ahead and so forth. I want to take a moment here to thank all of our panelists. I also want to take a moment before I ask you all to join me in doing that to advertise 2 other events that we will have in this series. Later on this week on Friday, we will have a documentary series entitled The Tiananmen. This is a documentary, an 8-part documentary series that was commissioned in 1989 for the 40th anniversary of the People's Republic, which was then not released. So this will be shown in full here. You can join for as much of that documentary series as you would like during the course of the day. But we will also have a conversation to kick off that series by Professor Wang, but also the director of that series will be joining us virtually for the discussion on Friday as well. And then next week on Wednesday at 4:30, we will have a discussion by Bao Pu entitled An Insider View of Mao's Reign, which discusses the life of his father, Bao Tong, which, if that's not a familiar name to some of you, he served as a political secretary to General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who, as many of you know, was then removed in 1989. So I think this will give you both this sense of a look backwards at some of the immediate elements. We'll have a number of discussions that will happen during the course of the month that will look at contemporary issues, including the U.S.-China relationship and the economy and so forth. So I just want to urge you to join us for as much of that series as you are able to, and please join me in a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you all for being here with us.